If you're watching this on The Prepper Historian, subscribe right now, because today we're digging into 8 battlefield survival tricks from the Second World War that were so effective, so quietly legendary among the men who used them, that many were kept off the books or buried in after-action reports. These aren't the romanticized campfire stories or the watered-down myths. These are the real field-tested habits, hacks and improvisations that kept soldiers alive when the manual wasn't enough. And if you're a serious history buff or a survival-minded viewer, you'll appreciate how these old methods still translate directly into modern preparedness. So let's get into it. How soldiers learned that disciplined heat management could decide whether you lived through winter operations. Eastern Front winters didn't just freeze rivers, they froze unprepared men solid. Veterans knew that overheating was more dangerous than cold itself. A soldier who broke a sweat under a heavy coat was a soldier who would be shivering uncontrollably minutes later. The trick was to open the coat from the bottom, not the top, letting heat vent without letting snow blast your chest. It sounds small, but it kept your core stable while allowing the steam and moisture to escape. Modern preppers can apply this exactly the same way on hikes or winter bug-outs. Don't wait to adjust layers. Strip down early, not late. Control heat so you never create moisture inside your clothes. It's not glamorous, but it's one of those small discipline habits that soldiers credited for saving fingers, toes, and sometimes entire patrols. Why quiet fire-starting methods were considered classified fieldcraft. In occupied Europe, Allied reconnaissance teams often avoided standard fire-starting methods because flames and sparks carried too far on clear nights. Some units learned to ignite tinder by using a heated rifle barrel or canteen cup instead of open sparks. Others used small coal seeds, tiny, secretly stowed charred cloth that could smoulder invisibly for hours. These methods let soldiers stay hidden from patrols and dogs. A prepper today can use the same principle when stealth matters, whether camping in contested environments or avoiding attention after a disaster. Start with pre-charred material, shield your heat source, and maintain a controlled ember rather than a flash of flame. The trick is minimizing signature, something WWII soldiers obsessed over. How soldiers stretched water supplies with a method that officers rarely wrote down. In North Africa and the Pacific, dehydration killed quietly. Soldiers developed the habit of micro-rations, taking a tiny mouthful of water, swishing it, then swallowing slowly. This wasn't the Hollywood sip and save myth. It was a physiological trick that actually increased perceived hydration and stretched canteen life. The other part of the trick involved eating salty foods only when water was available, never during scarcity. Veterans swore by it, but commanders discouraged wide distribution because men tended to over-ration and collapse. For preppers, practice micro-rations only when you've evaluated your full supply and environment. Pair it with shade, slowed pace, and avoiding unnecessary talking to reduce water loss. It's an old trick, but effective when done intelligently. Now, why was trenchline dependence on improvised noise traps such a closely guarded secret? Well, not every patrol had access to things like trip flares or mines, you see, so soldiers had to get creative, rigging up tin cans, spare bolts, and even mess kit lids along the most likely approach paths. But honestly, the real secret wasn't the trap itself. It was all about placement. The experienced men, they didn't bother setting noise traps along the obvious approaches. Instead, they'd put them on the routes they themselves would use if they were trying to sneak in. This insight, right here, turned those traps from simple alarms into proper psychological weapons. So, if you're applying this today for property protection or maybe campsite monitoring, place your early warning setups not on the main path, but on those indirect, shaded, or seemingly less important angles of approach. The World War II mindset was dead simple. Always think like the intruder. Here's how soldiers protected themselves from airburst shrapnel using a ground trick that's rarely explained outside veteran circles. Artillery airbursts were absolutely deadly because the shrapnel rained downwards. Soldiers learned to lie flat with their gear positioned above them at a slight angle, so the metal would scatter across the pack instead of straight onto their backs. Some even dug shallow body-length ruts, not full foxholes, mind you, just enough to scoop out in seconds. This improvised micro-trench reduced exposure dramatically. When you look at it from a modern preparedness angle, the lesson is clear. Use the terrain instantly and intelligently. Whenever there's an overhead hazard, falling debris, collapsing branches, or flying fragments, a few seconds spent shaping the ground around you can honestly create life-saving cover. You know, soldiers were swearing by scent, masking long before modern recon units ever formalized it. Partisans and recon patrols, especially in those dense forested regions, learned to mask their human scent by storing their outer clothing in pine needles or even smoke before heading out on missions. Dogs, back then, were trained to track specific human odours, not the general forest scent profiles, and this little approach threw them off just long enough for someone to escape. The method was kept pretty quiet, really, because if the enemy caught wind of it, well, they'd just retrain their dogs. These days, preppers can use scent masking more for wildlife interaction rather than, evading humans. Hunters already do this, and with great success, I might add. The practical takeaway here is simple. Clothing absorbs environmental cues, so use that to your advantage. Now, here's something interesting. How soldiers reduced noise discipline using a clever trick they picked up from indigenous scouts. Some specialized units learned to roll their feet along the outside edge first, not the heel, a technique borrowed straight from native and Aboriginal scouting traditions. It really cut noise dramatically, especially when moving through brush or debris. The trick was usually taught informally, so enemy counterintelligence couldn't get it down in writing. Preppers can test this out on any forest trail. Just try walking normally, then try walking with that outside edge roll. You'll feel the difference right away, I promise. It's a skill absolutely worth practicing because, honestly, it's one of the few ways to reduce your sound profile without needing any extra gear. The quietest field trick of all, though, involved how soldiers position themselves when resting. In enemy territory, you never faced the direction you expected danger from. Instead, you positioned yourself so you'd wake at the slightest change in ambient sound. Maybe the wind shifting, boots scraping, or a twig snapping. Veterans used to claim that lying with one ear to the ground actually trained your body to pick up vibrations before your brain was even fully awake. It wasn't anything mystical. It was just adaptation. Modern preppers can apply this by developing rest discipline, choosing positions that maximize awareness, setting controlled rest rotations, and of course avoiding deep sleep in risky environments. These 8 survival habits, well, they weren't flashy, but they were brutally effective, shaped by fear, necessity, and the quiet wisdom of men who frankly learned the hard way. If you want more historically grounded survival guides like this, go ahead and subscribe to The Prepper Historian and share this video so more people can learn from the past.